Well, good evening everyone, and welcome back to Culture Underground. Item number SCP-173, Object Class Euclid. Special Containment Procedures. Item SCP-173 is to be kept in a locked container at all times. When personnel must enter SCP-173's container, no fewer than 3 may enter at any time, and the door is to be relocked behind them. At all times, 2 persons must maintain direct eye contact with SCP-173 until all personnel have vacated and relocked the container. That's the beginning of a creepypasta known as SCP-173. If you're not familiar with what a creepypasta is, it's basically a short story designed to creep people out. There's not a lot of common themes in internet creepypastas. They tend to spawn from the demented mind of whoever created them, and the most popular ones sometimes inspire imitators. Whoever it is that wrote SCP-173 succeeded in the imitator department in spades. Nowadays, the SCP Foundation is a almost well-known thing on the internet. I say almost because there are actually a lot of people out there on the internet who have never heard of it. But the fact of the matter is, there are over 6,000 SCP entries now, and they are all written by people who have been fascinated by this idea that there are objects out there that are dangerous and must be contained. They're dangerous because they are, in the Foundation's own words, anomalous. I find the SCP Foundation fascinating less from the quality of its fare, which is very erratic, and more from the perspective of an internet phenomenon. You see, the SCP Foundation is open source. Anyone can create an SCP and submit it for the Foundation's consideration. However, this does lead to quality control issues, and in fact, the Foundation has had issues in this regard in the past. Disagreements about what exactly the SCP project is meant to be. And since it's open sourced, everyone can take it and try and put their own spin on it. I think it's fascinating both that so many people were enamored at the idea of SCP-173 and that it went so wildly off the rails. A quick perusal of the SCP archives shows that while the first entry, 173, is quite creepy, not all of them are. Some of them are, in fact, rather cutesy. Some of them are, they feel more like a slasher fic than a psychological horror, like a creature that can only move when you're not looking at it would be. Now, I know that SCP-173 is not terribly original. It's basically a weeping angel, a kind of monster that was introduced in the Doctor Who franchise a couple of months before SCP-173 was first published to the internet. The fascinating thing about 173 was the way it was presented. For starters, there's the fact that it was number 173 of something. And then there was the way that it was described to us in a series of procedures and notes and warnings, telling us that it was dangerous and that bad things would happen to us if we didn't look at it at all times, but kind of leaving a lot of things to the imagination. As people extrapolated on these ideas, they fleshed out the idea of the Secure, Contain, Protect Foundation, a group of people who contain cryptids and other anomalous objects in an effort to keep people safe from them and them safe from people. This lore may not even have been in the mind of the person who originally wrote 173. It was all contributions from later writers. And that's fascinating because the lore around the Foundation is actually very consistent. It has a clear structure, it has an origin story, it has certain key events that make up its history, and then everyone gets to play in this sandbox. However, while some of the SCPs are fascinating and frightening in equal measures, some of them are not. And it is this contradiction that has given the SCP people so many headaches in the past. and I'm speaking now in the meta sense of the people who write it, it's very fun to look through the records for something like SCP-914, which is basically a mechanical object that transmogrifies items in totally random and sometimes malicious fashion. But reading SCP-914 is more like reading a slapstick sitcom than it is reading a horror story. And that, well, in a world where you have things like the very tough lizard, the shy guy, and Site-13, well, SCP-914 feels very, very out of place. And I guess that's just the hazard of this kind of communal created universe that the SCP archives represent. You're going to have to take the good with the bad. And I think that's one of the things that makes it fun to engage with and frustrating at the same time. Now, there are a lot of creators who have made good names for themselves through working with the SCP Foundation. My favorite is Evan Royalty, who makes really great independent films that he publishes to YouTube, chronicling the adventures of a mobile task force, part of the Foundation's armed response to dangerous anomalies. And some creators have just used it as an opportunity to whet their writing skills before they move on to other things. I don't have problems with either one of those, but I have found that while I was initially quite enraptured in exploring the world of the SCP Foundation and figuring out what various clearance levels meant and whether I was right that the infamous D-class researcher was in fact just a disposable person that they use in their research, which they are, my interest in the SCP Foundation waned after a bit. There are a lot of really great ideas for stories, and there are some great self-contained stories that are told in really inventive ways through documents and transcripts and, just reports and write-ups. A kind of found footage approach to storytelling that is really fun to wade through. At the same time, you never know what you're going to get when you open a new SCP archive, and after a while, it becomes kind of discouraging. You don't want to open another file after you've read something like Site-13 or, a record of the Torso World, which I can't remember what that one is actually called or what its number is. But there was a artifact that opened portals to a world where giant human torsos dragged themselves around and ate anything they saw. Explorations of that were fascinating. And most of the stuff there is not up to that level of quality. And I guess anything on the internet is going to lack a certain degree of quality control. So I should expect that, but it's still a little disheartening. I still poke at the SCP archives from time to time, and I have ideas for stories that were entirely inspired by reading the SCP archives. But I think its value to an individual is going to depend on how much they like creepy stories of varying quality. If you spend a lot of time trolling the internet for urban legends and other creepy stuff, check out the SCP archives. It's definitely worth your time. If you're looking for different ways to approach storytelling, that kind of found footage or found document storytelling, as you will, is also really good. Otherwise, it may not be your thing. And yet, if you're looking to be an independent creator, you really should look at it just to get an idea of what is capable from a small, determined team who's really enthusiastic about something. The SCP archives are growing faster and faster these days just because so many people want to be a part of them. And I think that is an encouraging sign for anyone who wants to create anything on their own, even if the product itself is not to your taste. Anyway, that's all I've got for you today. There's a like button and subscribe button down below. You can use them as you see fit, and I will talk to you later.